Hi, in my email I talked about claim sentences for our peer-reviewed article paragraph. What I want to do here is zoom in on the support part of those paragraphs. And by that I mean the two things that I've highlighted here on the rubric. One, the first is the idea that we're going to have detailed and specific evidence. That evidence is going to be things like quotes, passages, but it can also be data or examples from the article. Quotes, passages, data, examples. Lots of different kinds of support in peer-reviewed articles. Also, of course, we want to practice that important skill of integrating brief quotes into sentences. We all already know how to drop big quotes. What we want to learn is that next level skill of working smaller quotes into our own language that frames and interprets, introduces, and explains quotes. So let's take a look at what happens in the paragraph. So first of all, after the claim, we see there's a brief sentence here kind of highlighting what Papa is doing with Cambodian American students and talking about how it's about focusing on their community and empowering that community in its resistance to histories of colonialism. So when we get to wanting to bring in evidence, in some ways, this is evidence. This description of what Papa was doing, this idea of taking pictures and write talk about those pictures, that's an example of the kind of thing Papa was doing to develop resistant capital. So that is a good example of a specific detail. The detail is an example from the article. In the next sentence, we get an example of a quote. Again, notice how it's a short quote. It's part of a much longer sentence. Notice how there's language from me, the writer, before and language after. Okay, so those are key things we want to think about as we find these quotes. We want to frame them with our own language and interpretation. Again, we get into details from Papa's article, but here's what's really important. We're not only given the details, they're explained to us, right? So this sentence explains why it's important to know what Papa was doing and understand how that detail connects to agency, specific strategies for change. We also get another example here of from the article, this idea of a roadmap for educators. And we get a quote, one word, factors, and then we get the longer quote that kind of identifies some of those factors. In this case, that longer quote is introduced by a colon. That colon occurs because there's a complete sentence before the quote. And rather than just plopping the quote, we bridge it with a colon. So this is an interesting technique we haven't seen before. Quoting one word in your main sentence, having a colon at the end with a list of quoted words after the colon. Pretty cool setup. Again, once that quote is presented, we get a sentence explaining it. So notice how the model introduces examples, introduces quotes, introduces evidence, but then afterwards explains it, not just in the same sentence, but in a sentence or two after it. Finally, we're going to talk about the end. Notice the use of an integrated quote here too. We're going to talk about the last sentence of the paragraph more when we meet in class tomorrow, because it's kind of a different idea for us, but we're going to want to connect the research in the support part of our paragraph back to our originally presented concept. And so what we're going to see here is we get that reminder of resistant capital. Everything's tied back to the resistant capital that was defined in that first explained paragraph. So the last sentences here of this paragraph take us back to the explained paragraph. So I just wanted to highlight some examples of the kind of support we want to try to work with, we want to try to incorporate into our drafts of our peer-reviewed paragraphs. And remember, it's just a draft. We just want to get some quotes worked into some sentences with some explanations and interpretations, and we'll see where we go from there, and we rewrite it and we make it better. So it's more important to take a shot at it than come to class with something perfect. All right, thanks everybody.